would like to acknowledge that the University of Calgary is on the traditional lands of the Niitsitapi Blackfoot Confederacy, which include Kainaiwa, Siksika, and Piikani, and the peoples of Treaty 7, including the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, Chiniki, Wesley, and Bearspaw, and the Tsuut'ina First Nations. In addition, the City of Calgary is homeland to Métis Nation Region 3. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that land acknowledgement, Sandy, and welcome back. I just want you to know how grateful I am for your support during these sessions. So again, I know we should get going. We're just a little bit after 12 now. So I'm very glad for those again who've joined from last week. Welcome back, and for new faces again, I hope I'm able to provide a good overview and a recap so you can kind of get caught up. We covered a lot last week and quite a bit, and so this workshop here is kind of along the same lines. So what I'm going to do is I'll go ahead and share my screen with you, and we'll just get going that way. I hope that you can, I'm going to share my screen. You don't need to see my email though. Okay. All right. I hope you can all see that all right. So today we're going to just kind of pick up from where we were left off, and maybe Sandy, if I can just get you to monitor the participants and admit them as they come in, that would be wonderful.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. So last time when we were together, we really looked at identity, and so I'm gonna begin where we were. So we'll look at. I'll provide a little bit of a recap of some of the key points that I brought up last week in our in our time together. So really looking at understanding those distinctions and looking at ways of being. Why does identity matter in curriculum development? And we also looked at those principles to actions. And then this workshop is concerned with ways of connecting, so relationships. So I'm going to unpack a bit the ethical space and implications for curriculum development. How is being in the ethical space? What are some of those implications? Then I'm also going to look at accountability approaches from a Indigenous and institutional sort of what are those distinctions? Let's understand those distinctions, and then we can really start looking at some of those parallels. And then again, looking at putting this principle into action, and then offering some frameworks for connecting with other ways of knowing and other ways of being. So I hope that sounds okay. And I hope for those of you like last time, for those of you who have any questions, I will ask Sandy to kind of monitor the chat. And Sandy, I'm fine with you sort of interjecting and letting me know if somebody is waiting for to contribute. So please feel free to contribute. I see, even though I'm really going to be providing some information and doing some talking, quite a bit of talking. I'm really hoping that you're going to feel comfortable enough to ask me some questions and provide some some contributions and that we can have a real dialogue. I see these sessions as more of an informal opportunity for me to share some information and for us to certainly exchange knowledge. So before I jump into that, I want to share this opportunity with you, because I think for those of you who are doing curriculum work, especially at the your units at the program level, new curriculum development within academic programs, resource development, community engagement, consultation, engaging elders and traditional knowledge keepers in curriculum review and development processes, or a curriculum needs assessment. This opportunity is really, I think it's going to really help you along with your work. And so this is some Indigenous curriculum grants that are being offered through the Office of Indigenous Engagement, and with support from the Vice Provost of Teaching and Learning in the Taylor Institute. So really around supporting programs with funding to help advance Indigenous engagement and Indigenous perspectives in the curriculum. And so this is just some information about it. The curriculum grants are intended to provide up to $10,000 to support initiatives. An average of 5 curriculum grants will be provided each year over the next 5 years. And then there's some in-kind resources, in-kind asks that are really along the, really aligning with the notion of the reciprocity. So even matching funds if units or have the capacity for that. So some of the criteria is I just have it in point form here. So these initiatives are designed to have a direct impact on student learning. And so I'll let you read those. I'll let you go through those while I'm going to see if I can get, I'm going to see, I don't know if I'll be able to actually, I'm going to try and get this into the chat. I'm going to see if I can get a document in here. So just give me a moment. Okay. Well, it says that this document sent successfully. So I hope you all are able to access it. So these are the Indigenous curriculum grants. And I strongly encourage you to think about how some of our conversations, some of the information that I'm presenting around the curriculum principles will support your work if you do decide to apply for or put in a proposal for one of the grants. So anyhow, I'm just going to give a very brief overview of the curriculum, the Indigenous curriculum principles. So the first one, the one that we looked at last week, was ways of being. So the notion of transformation and renewal, the ways of being, this principle of understanding and identifying how your personal values and beliefs influence curriculum. The next one that we're going to be talking about today is related to ways of connecting, the principle of cultivating relational accountability in curriculum development approaches. The one we'll be covering next week is ways of doing, ways of knowing, I should say, sorry about that. doing and connecting, the principle of practicing reciprocity. And then the final principle is around validation. So validating the curriculum through a parallel process that recognizes the knowledge, authority, and expertise of Indigenous peoples as self-determining entities in the curriculum development process. And I want to highlight that these principles are all interconnected. They're very interdependent of one another. They are interrelated, and we move through these along the curriculum development. We're always looking at critical self-reflection. We're always kind of in that iterative process of identifying how who we are may change through curriculum processes. And so I wanted to highlight that. So just going on to where we were. So the first principle really opens up this ethical space to reveal the null curriculum, which is that which is not taught. So the null curriculum is certainly driven by our paradigms, which refers to, and a paradigm, as I mentioned in our last session, just refers to a set of beliefs that guide our actions and our behaviors. So we looked at paradigms, personal knowledge, and dialogue, and at the notion of paradigm, the role of our paradigm in shaping our knowledge, as well as the importance of dialogue. I shared how Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing are shaped through a relational paradigm, and the concept that we are all related to each other, to the natural environment, and to the spiritual world is expressed through a very familiar axiom: all my relations. We exist within a set of relational alliances that bring about these interdependencies. We also explored knowledge and how these principles that I outlined in the previous slide really call upon settler and other non-Indigenous educators and curriculum developers to examine their own truths, and the possibilities of rebuilding or building a relationship with Indigenous knowledges and people. So exploring how you know what you know will help to identify limitations, gaps in knowledge, and possibilities for growth. So we kind of looked at questions like, what is knowledge? Is knowledge separate from us? What is our relationship to it? What is our relationship to our own knowledge? So I really sort of advanced some of those questions. And then dialogue, curriculum development and planning demands dialogue. We sometimes confuse consultation with dialogue, though, yet it is dialogue that transforms our practices and relationships and requires specific skill sets such as humility and deep listening. And then I did a bit of a comparison between curriculum development approaches from an Indigenous perspective, curriculum development approaches from an institutional perspective. So looking at those Indigenous perspectives, utilizing a distinction-based Indigenous pedagogy and planning approach. So the importance of this is really underscored with the importance of moving over to make room for Indigenous epistemological sovereignties. And this is quite a different demand than simply including Indigenous ways of knowing. Instead, it's the agenda that Indigenous people set as a self-determining one that really guides the curriculum process. The starting point is self, so that positionality, right? This emerges from Indigenous ethics and the notions that we exist within a web of relational alliances. I also talked about the idea that Indigenous relationship building with Indigenous people, and to see them as rights holders. This was, the notion of rights holders as opposed to simply stakeholders. So these workshops and what I'm talking about here, this gets us deeper into the principles and sort of unpacks the complexities at the heart of the curriculum principles. And so I talked about that last week, and this idea that curriculum development is underscored by the needs of the Indigenous community. And this is an important one, because oftentimes curriculum development is really, we say, we say, well, we're want to respond to the needs of the students, but definitely we do it within the framework of our institution, right? So the institution really shapes, I would say, the needs of the students, or defines those needs. And then some of those those parallel points are, validation and approval. And this is the same, that these are some what are, I would like to say, intersecting points there. So we looked at ways of, and then I unpack the principle of understanding and identifying your personal values and beliefs, and looking at putting the principles into action. We looked at the certain frameworks as entry points for self-reflection, and also the role of critical self-reflection in all of this. So some questions you might think about exploring, where does your knowledge come from? How do you know what you know? What is the purpose of knowledge? What is important to know? What is important to learn, or even to forget? How do we understand an absence of? So the notion of absence of the null curriculum is connected to a cult of forgetfulness. And so I talked about this last week. And how do your values and your beliefs shape your understandings about what you place importance on? And so these were just some of the points that we talked about last week, and we were able to generate some good dialogue around that. And before I jump into the next and jump right into shared space, ethical space, and into this next principle, I'm just wondering if I just want to stop there and just check in with everyone, see if anyone has any questions, or has anything they'd like to offer, any comments, or how was that? We didn't have an opportunity to debrief or anything like that, but just wanted to put it out there and see if anybody has anything to offer in terms of what we talked about last week. Oh, thank you, Nancy. Yes, I'm very grateful to connect. Ivy, I'm glad that the chart is useful. Still processing the information. Good. So, and it's like, this is going to take some time, right? Some of the ideas are pretty heavy, and we don't typically, we've got a pretty, when it comes to curriculum development, we have this process that we've become accustomed to. And so how do we build on that, right? And what are some of the things that we need to consider when we're doing curriculum development with regards to incorporating Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous places, or how Indigenous people build relationship with those places. And so this next principle is really about relationships. So I'm going to go over this, the principle of cultivating relational accountability and curriculum development approaches. And these are just some highlights from this principle here. So indigenous epistemology is grounded in local contexts. Indigenous knowledge is local knowledge and generated through multiple embodied experiences with the land and Indigenous people. It is always best to begin connecting with the traditional guardians of the land. So if we look at the region that we're in, the city of Calgary, now we talk about, the people of Treaty 7. It's also important to keep in mind that Indigenous people have been here before the signing of treaties. So for example, the original guardians of these territories, the Blackfoot peoples, who have occupied and been guardians of these lands for thousands and thousands of years, and so drawing on that knowledge first. And I think it's interesting to even think about what our kids are learning in school. And I'll never forget when my kids were younger and they come home from school and they'd say, Mom, why are we learning about, not that it's not important to learn about the Iroquois and all of those Indigenous nations, but they're so far away. Why are we not learning about the people here? Why are we not learning about our neighbors, the people, the Tsutsina? Why are we not learning about them? Why are we not learning about us? Why aren't we learning about Blackfoot people? And so, we tend to the curriculum can also distance us from one another in I think really direct ways. So again, it's always best to begin connecting with the traditional guardians of the land. And curriculum development modalities do not occur in isolation from community, from land, and from knowledge keepers. So shared space and ways of connecting, as highlighted in our strategy, our Idapadope strategy, emphasize the importance of relationship building, of community engagement, and of ethical spaces for dialogue. Relational accountability means being responsible to the Indigenous nations, communities, and individuals from which curricular concepts and knowledges may be derived from. The pattern of Indigenous Canadian relationships has been a unilateral one, which means as Indigenous people, we have been left out of decision-making processes that directly affect our lives. And so even in curriculum now, when I'm taught about, and I'm just going to use myself as an example, I have absolutely no control of how people teach me or teach about me. There's a difference between teaching about and teaching with, right? Just like researching about and researching with. And so it's really important to keep in mind that this pattern of how Indigenous, this very paternalistic approach of how the government and other systems have constructed images of Indigenous people in very specific ways that really are not often accurate images of who Indigenous people are. Being aware and understanding that shared space also encompasses broader internation, Indigenous relational contexts and perspectives, and these continue to impact academic spaces. Attending to internation contexts means being aware that Indigenous peoples are often guided by internation protocols. So, and that a pan-Indigenous approach is something that we really need to move away from. Internation protocols means, I'll give you an example. When as a Blackfoot person in traditional territories of these are the ancestral lands of the Blackfoot people. It's not. I wouldn't be giving a land acknowledgement and acknowledging the people of the lands, because I'm part of that. But if I was to go to the Anishinaabe lands, I would definitely be giving a land acknowledgement there. I would definitely be bringing gifts, because they're my hosts, and I'm a visitor to those territories. And so there are specific internation protocols that are at work, even in curriculum development. And this notion that I can't speak on behalf of all Indigenous people is an important one. It's in line with those protocols as well. Relational accountability occurs through connection. It occurs through engagement and learning, and it occurs through dialogue. Direct experiences in relationship to land, people, knowledges, histories, and languages inform the curriculum. Critical self-reflection and collective dialogue on the principle of relational accountability can assist in identifying both possibilities for expanding relational networks and gaps in knowledge and processes that will require attention. So I'm going to move on and talk about Willie Ermine's ethical space of engagement. So the ethical space of engagement is a theoretical concept that was first coined by ethicist Roger Poole and later repurposed by Willie Ermine to refer to a theoretical space that opens up when two divergent thought systems meet. This space is hidden and only accessed through dialogue, which reveals assumptions and biases and offers the potential for transformed perspectives. The space is also in constant flux, meaning that the space changes, which reflects the changing and evolving nature of relationships. So at the most basic level, the ethical space allows us to confront the historical and contemporary relationships between settler society and Indigenous people within a critical anti-colonial theoretical construction. Additionally, the ethical space offers a framework within which to analyze challenges and envision opportunities for advancing mutual interests based on shared understandings and a willingness to find common ground upon which to dialogue. So how is the ethical space used? Ethical space moves us beyond surface level approaches based on outward external awareness and allows us to see patterns of rupture in our relationships, such as our focus on training rather than dialogue and relationships, or of our school system's failure to educate about race and racism. The ethical space acts as a theoretical point of reference that assists us to illuminate hidden undercurrents of thought, or as Ermine puts it, the enfolded dimension that needs to be acknowledged and brought to bear, which is necessary in order for meaningful engagement and honest human-to-human dialogue to occur. The ethical space is about also revealing individual biases and assumptions that might unconsciously influence how we action our knowledge in ways that perpetuate colonial ideologies. So what does dialogue look like in the ethical space? So taking Indigenous autonomy and self-determination seriously, this requires a fundamental shift in order to make space for Indigenous perspectives to emerge in accordance with our own terms. Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars argue that we often undertake development and planning work in a context marked by a fully present and often raw legacy of colonization, and an urban context that makes indigeneity invisible, and a limiting politics of recognition that consistently thwarts the practice of Indigenous sovereignty. So non-Indigenous and Indigenous educators ask, what is the work that needs to be done by non-Indigenous educators? So recognizing that Indigenous people create the terms of our struggle, and we do create these terms, and we speak on our own terms, and therefore and there is, of course, a clear and present danger that alliance work by non-Indigenous people might be undertaken with paternalistic intent, white guilt, or the presumption of Indigenous deficit. Conceptualizing and creating ethical space is not about stepping blindly into relational interactions in the hopes that we can all get along and put differences aside. Instead, engaging in the ethical space means we are prepared to ask the brave questions. What are we willing to leave behind, and how do we move forward? How do we transform our personal and professional practices to better reflect multiple ways of knowing and doing? How do we learn to live well with what seem like radical differences, honoring these differences while resisting an urge to assimilate, whether into an Indigenous or a Western paradigm? So I think these are all important questions and opportunities that the ethical space offers for us to really dialogue about topics that we often don't get an opportunity to talk about, especially even in curriculum development processes. So I want to stop there for a minute and just check in with the group and see if anybody has anything to offer, or any questions or any comments. I'm just going to refer to the chat here. Yeah, absolutely, Fabiola. The null curriculum is something that we really need to pay attention to. All right, I'll just keep going.
Oh, Caitlin said something in the chat here.
Oh, okay, sure. Oh, your reminder about the danger of alliance work is important. That stands out. Thank you, Caitlin. I want to, I'm doing some work with the Office of Indigenous Engagement around a project called Towards Being a Good Relative. As I was doing the research for that project, I came across a really important, what I found was a really important quotation around allyship and alliances, creating a framework, a allyship framework, or even what it means to be an ally. One of the quotations was, the work of an ally should not so much be concerned with fighting for or protecting Indigenous people, but really the fight is not about protecting Indigenous people. The fight of an ally is within themselves, to ensure that they're fighting with the urge to those like white saviorism or use power in ways where it's actually very disempowering. So I found that really impactful and a good reminder. So ethical space and implications for curriculum development. So sitting in discomfort, getting comfortable with being discomforted, exploring other frames of reference whilst being critically self-aware of our own. Discomfort means confronting and deconstructing how consultation and engagement are typically approached in the institution. Libby Porter, a non-Indigenous urban planner, highlights that the ways colonial systems mostly choose to engage with its responsibility to Indigenous people is wrapped up in a structure of privilege that sustains the very dynamic it purports to be trying to overcome. There has been a recent rush to engage with Indigenous people such that many representatives and Indigenous community-based organizations are experiencing engagement fatigue and are unable to keep up with the demand. Engagement fatigue is brought on by a deeper problem. All of the engaging is usually done on the terms of non-Indigenous institutions. One outcome is sheer tokenism, but the deeper dimension is the politics of recognition in which so much engagement and consultation, even when not tokenistic or cyclical, is embedded. Indigenous people are thought of as one more stakeholder at the table, who add another diverse voice to a planning sphere, which does not itself change. The ethical space allows us to facilitate dialogue around a shared colonial history, and the kind of dialogue that will illuminate complicity in colonization. And this is relational work. This relational work is simultaneously a site of resistance and transformation. The ethical space provides safety to talk about unsafe topics. And such structural violence is one such topic. Ryan Walker writes that structural violence involves institutions and social practices that systematically prevent Indigenous people from meeting their needs, enacting self-expression, and achieving goals that would constitute a good life. This is characterized as structural violence. It takes form in an unequal balance of power and resources, and the extent to which tools of colonial governance serve to structure persistent material and discursive marginalization among Indigenous people. This type of violence is often not disapproved of. In curriculum planning, it can go unchallenged, and is often implicitly supported through conventional political, cultural, economic, and social norms of the institution. When curriculum development processes do not consider notions of Indigenous sovereignty or perpetuate ignorance, either willfully or unconsciously, and understand relationships in only a consultative stakeholder framework driven by hierarchical authority and frugal budgets, they reproduce structural violence. The ethical space enables us to recognize structural violence and create processes that will help us to avoid perpetuating it. We can dialogue about, oh yeah, please.
Sorry, there are two comments in the chat.
Thank you for that. So Fabian, the challenging context of the educational system framed by the institution is an important takeaway for me. I'm glad to hear that, Fabian. Savannah says, my biggest issue has been financially compensating knowledge keepers, elders. The resistance of administrators has continually been a problem for my work. Absolutely, 100%. I hear that. There's always this this financial, the financial constraints of the institution. And this is what I was talking about in an earlier slide about the needs, right? The needs, even though we say curriculum development is driven by the needs of the students, ultimately it is framed in the context of the need to be frugal. And it's driven by politics and predetermined outcomes that the government is imposing on institutions. And so absolutely, thank you for those comments. So dialogue is concerned with providing space for exploring fields of thought, and attention is given to understanding how thought functions in governing our behaviors. And it encourages the ethical space encourages faculty to be objective about themselves and their thinking. So it's this notion of outside looking in at yourself. It addresses the null curriculum or absence of Indigenous perspectives, and it protects Indigenous knowledges. This is really important. This idea of protection for Indigenous knowledges. Indigenous knowledges have been misused, they've been misinterpreted, and they've been appropriated and used to advance government agendas. And so these principles and carefully planning, careful critical self-reflection, collective dialogue, and building relationships with Indigenous peoples, these are all mechanisms for protecting Indigenous knowledges that will in turn transform curriculum processes. In education, curriculum projects are often already envisioned, planning frameworks are set, and budgets are finalized before Indigenous people even come to the table. This is too often an exercise in box ticking when doing Indigenous engagement. And so when I'm talking about building relationships, and I'm talking about this principle is related to that connection, right? That the work of relationship building and ways of connecting, we often think instead of consultation and of how are we gonna, how are we going to, these are what my dean wants to ensure Indigenous perspectives are in here. Let's go and connect with the campus elder. Let's see what they say, and then we can, tick it off, right? And so this is often the approach, which does not foster a sense of relationality. The ethical space fosters this sacred space of relationships. And when I say sacred space, that relationships are imbued with the spirit of that evokes good feelings, that evokes balance and harmony. And how are we advancing that in our institutes of higher education? Jane Preston argues that one of the first steps towards building a curriculum based on a shared future is understanding each other's worldviews, the lens through which one perceives and interprets life, because our core values and norms are embedded within us and frequently prevent us from understanding each other. In order to improve and renew education, we need to create ethical spaces where different views, cultures, and life experiences are recognized equally within a mutually respected, balanced team of people, all different kinds of people. I have this quotation here: confidence without clarity is a disaster. And these are words spoken by Eastern mystic Sadhguru. And I listen to some of his podcasts every now and then, and I'm always struck with his with some of his ideas. And this, when he said this, he said it too often in our Western education system, being whether we label ourselves an expert or whether we are are given that that label by others around us, but it gives us a lot of confidence, you know. And when it comes to Indigenous people and what motivates us, and what is, you know, what does Gabe mean when she's talking about sacred? You know, religion doesn't have a place in curriculum development. Well, I'm not talking about religion. You know, I'm not talking about this religious dogma that is, you know, belongs here or doesn't belong there. So what motivates Indigenous people, there's a real lack of clarity on the part of non-Indigenous people in terms of who we are, why we do the things we do, what is our relationship to knowledge, what is Indigenous people's relationship to power. Instead, it's simplified. It's filtered through a Western paradigm and simplified to these very binary constructions and binary images. We have we can have this wise shaman who is closer to nature, and then we juxtaposed with the drunken Indian. We have the Indigenous person that doesn't pay taxes, that doesn't do, is so lazy. But then on the other end of the spectrum, we have this selfless Indigenous academic who is doing so much and is such a sage, and all of that. So there, my point is oftentimes people are they're confident enough to start building curriculum about Indigenous people without clarity on who Indigenous people are. And that has disastrous results. And I know I'm being recorded, and I'm not afraid to say that the K-6 Alberta curriculum revamp is a prime example of this disaster. Confidence without clarity. I think we need to spend a lot of time on that. So I'm going to do a little bit of a comparison and contrast here again, and look at relational accountability approaches. So understanding these distinctions so we can see some parallels. So what is the work that needs to be done in curriculum planning for non-Indigenous planning curriculum planners to attend to the agenda of Indigenous planning, Indigenous curriculum planning? This idea of exploring self in relation can be seen as an attempt to create forms of practice that are going to activate this ethic of accountability. So I'm just going to check the chat here. So let's look at Indigenous approaches to relationships. So again, I talked about the idea of relationality. So when Indigenous people get together and we're dialoguing about things that are of direct importance to us, we build relationships. We always start with prayer, and we're always humorous. There's always a place for humor. I remember Dr. Leroy Little Bear says, we're all, even in serious situations, we'll sometimes crack a joke, or we'll bring humor into that, because it's our way of validating the fact that we really can't take life too seriously, because it changes. That's one thing that we can be sure of, is that situations are going to change. Everything is temporary. So we need to enjoy the moment. We need to laugh. We need to create good feelings. We need to be reciprocal. We need to be relational. We need to recognize the role of the spiritual in our planning practices. And when I say spiritual, I mean recognizing that energy that guides us beyond the physical. Institutional approaches to relationships are really framed within these curriculum partnerships. We're business partners, we're learning partners, we're research partners, and so there's a real distance there. We're coming together for a certain task. We're going to create a curriculum working group, and after this we'll have this partnership for this long, and after that it'll dissolve. I don't know if I'm ever going to see you again, or if I do see you, I'll say hi in the the Zoom or in the hallway, and that's kind of it, right? So this notion of holistic connectedness, we're accountable to the knowledge that we generate through our curriculum processes, knowledge through participation in relationships, direct experience, ceremonies. We're accountable to the stories that we share, the art that we create, the spiritual aspects of our existence. We're accountable to our dreams. We're accountable to our intuition, as well as acting responsibly regarding our cognitive insights, our reflections, analysis, and synthesis. And when I say acting responsibly in regards to our cognition, this really means understanding the limitations of our cognition as one aspect. It's only one aspect of how we come to know the world around us. So instead of getting to know one another and building relationships with one another in really human to human ways, we create spaces in our professional institutions for people to be trained on how to work with one another, for people to be trained on such things as cultural awareness and how to work with difference, right? Without really getting a deeper understanding and exploring what is the nature of this difference, and what is it about me that I need to change? And so that's kind of that those are all sort of part and parcel of this idea of holistic connectedness. I don't know how else to talk about that. And English fails me quite a bit in terms of trying to get an Indigenous perspective out there, because most Indigenous languages are all verb based, so they're all participatory. You're participating in you're speaking your relationships, you're embodying them through your language. We'll look at institutional approaches to relationships. So very consultative, right? The process of seeking and valuing opinions and the experience of experts and various legitimate stakeholders is an integral part of the broader curriculum development process, right? Consulting with people who may be affected by curricular proposals or should be involved in the curriculum development process is seen as very important, and rightly so, of course. But this is often driven by materialism. So consultation and the amount of it and the nature of the conversations are often driven by materialism, monetary frugality, and ensuring that institutions spend as little as possible on change, which just amounts to maintaining the status quo. Discussions about Indigenous inclusion have always amounted to the bottom line. Indigenous scholar and community planner Leanna Patrick argues that funding frequently hinges on criteria that are not developed by Indigenous people and which reflects the goals and aspirations of the institution. Consultation or relationships is very much hierarchical. Due to the colonial nature of the institutions and multi-level issues, as well as financial considerations, consultations with deans and department heads, directors is going to be of the utmost importance, especially early on in the curriculum development process. So these relationships are very much top down. And whereas we look at balance, so at one part, there's these hierarchical processes, and then for an Indigenous approach, it's really about balance and understanding that every voice matters. Elders in particular play a vital role in the development of Indigenous curriculum. Our relationships with the natural world matter, and how we are connecting with these relationships is also considered. Collar and Rasmussen assert that Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island know that the land is our first teacher. And Indigenous approaches to relationships offer possibilities for transformation. So the possibilities of inclusion in all of our relationships. So the relational orientation of an Indigenous paradigm illuminates possibilities for expanding our connections through curriculum. Indigenous scholar and community Indigenous scholar, drawing on Patrick again, she says that mobilizing community support reorients and pivots definitions of success to align with Indigenous lifeways. Indigenous definitions of success are grounded in relational accountability. Long-term relationships of trust are carefully built and cultivated to counter the institutional harms inflicted on generations of Indigenous people and communities. Oftentimes, institutional approaches to curriculum development and relationships are really about solving problems. So really problem focused. Discussions revolve around problem solving. What are the problems? What are not the problems? But I think it's also really important to keep in mind that this problem solving approach has been Canada's towards Indigenous people. The Indian problem. Curriculum development in the context of Indigenous perspectives revolves around, or should revolve around, how to solve the problem of absence. But either way, we're still seen as problematic. So whether we're a problem because of our presence or we're a problem because of our absence, either way, it's problematic. So we need to focus on possibilities instead. Indigenous curriculum development and relationships is really about processes. And I think that's what really these principles are highlighting. They're very process driven. As you will see in my presentations here, these workshops, I don't talk about, I don't say by the end of these workshops, you will be able to identify, or the outcome of these workshops will be that you do this. It really is about a process. And I really see my role here as offering clarity and getting at some of the deeper complexities of curriculum development that are required to meet the vision of our Indigenous strategy, the Adapatope Indigenous strategy. So I'm just going to stop there. I've done quite a bit of talking. Faiza says, acceptance of multiple sources of knowledge is the way forward. I think so. I do. But how are we creating those spaces for that? And thank you, Ivy. Deeper reflection on this is definitely required. So I'm just going to highlight a few pieces here. So this is taken right from the curriculum the curriculum principles. So really looking at how we can put this principle into action. And I know a lot of times, and I've been in my consultations when I'm speaking with people or I'm giving talks, I recognize that people are a lot of times not interested in clarity. Like they're just not interested in it. They want to know how to do something. They want tools, they want solutions, and they want a way forward. They're not interested in clarity. They already have confidence. And so I end up very much focusing on resources, and so and very little control on how those resources are used. So principle to action, I wanted to offer something that would help people kind of launching off points. So a scenario here would be, your unit is developing a new certificate that requires a component on Indigenous knowledges, but there's a real lack of Indigenous community connections, so where do you start? So this will offer some points for launching off points anyways, where you might start expanding. First, we need to expand our understandings of relationships, right? And if we want to reach out and be a part of the circle of Indigenous pedagogy and Indigenous knowledges and learning and all of that, if we want to be part of the circle, we can't go in there with a very rigid mindset. We need to be able to be open. We need to be able to dialogue about that which we don't know, right? And admit what we don't know. It's like, well, I don't know this, and not knowing is a really intimidating thing, and especially in what we do. We're expected to have all the answers most of the time, and being in the position of the knower, of an expert, comes with certain expectations, and humility is not really one of the characteristics that's highly regarded in the institution. So anyhow, this offers some ways to start thinking about that. Let's brainstorm. Let's brainstorm some of the questions that I posed in that were posed in the curriculum principles, asking a team member to keep track of those and really dialoguing about that, what's out there. So this just kind of gives how you just some launching off points, as I said. Here's another framework for connecting, and really around guiding questions. What keeps me in my relational comfort zone? Which groups of people do I prefer to socialize with? What groups of people am I relationally invested with? What does relational accountability mean to me? Does my culture limit my relational circle? And how do you make the implicit explicit? Some questions you could ask: does the curriculum process offer opportunities to connect with Indigenous people? And sustainable outcomes, aligning intentions with behaviors and effects on relationships. How has this process helped me to embody my learning? In what ways have I grown? How can I sustain this practice in the future? You may have other questions, but these are just some frameworks, or just some questions that hopefully will be helpful to you. Another framework, along the same lines. Who am I relationally accountable to? What is my comfort level? What do I know about Indigenous people, and how did I learn it? Do I feel confident in my knowledge? Why or why not? How might I learn more? How do I know I'm building good relationships? How do I know I'm doing this? How will I know I'm doing this? when I attended I'm just going to stop sharing there. So when I attended a couple of weeks ago, I attended a health dialogue for the Blackfoot Confederacy, and not even just in that work there, but in some of the other work I've done as well. I think guiding questions are really important, because that's what we ended up doing in our dialogue. Is we ended up asking a whole set of questions that were extremely important to our nations, questions around our survival as nations, questions about the survival of our children, questions about how we're going to be protecting our knowledge, questions about the wellness of our people, and how are we going to advance an understanding of Indigenous wellness as we understand it. And so even if we can look at these kinds of these dialogues that are framed around key questions, and keeping in mind that sustainability for Indigenous people often it's not the same. It doesn't mean the same in terms of how we think of sustainability in the institution. We think about sustainable economies. Oftentimes it's really framed in materialism. For Indigenous people, sustainability really is about the continuity of life, and the continuity of autonomy and self-determination, and the continuity of our relationships. And so there's distinctions that I think we need to keep in mind. But I think at the end of the day as well, and this is what I'd like to come full circle in our last workshop, is really looking at the curriculum development. Let's look at the current curriculum development process that we use in the institution, and how can we really parallel that after going through these principles, right? And how can we parallel that with with an Indigenous, an Indigenous way of planning and development, where Indigenous voices are prioritized, where we see ourselves reflected in the curriculum in very respectful ways. Yeah, so I just kind of want to open it up. If anybody has any thoughts or any feedback on this principle, or even just what I said, let's dialogue. Are there any concepts that are still that you feel maybe so you've gotten some clarity around? Or I just want to offer this space and for anybody who who needs it for questions, eh?
Can you hear me?
I can, Ivy.
I guess one of the things I was thinking about was I was lucky to help work on the curriculum for the Alberta Superintendent Leadership Training Program with Alberta Education and Continuing Education at UCalgary. And we were really lucky to find a few Indigenous leaders who contributed to that curriculum and did our best with developing those relationships. But a lot of the times the people who are developing those relationships are on contracts. And so, I've moved on to a different contract, and we hope that those relationships will continue. But I'm just wondering about that, like even the structure of some of these contracts. that they're short term. And so we aren't really able to develop those long-term relationships that I think are needed.
Absolutely. You know, I think that that's a constraint, that's an institutional constraint that requires leaders to strategize around, is how, well, what are the goals of relationship building and engagement with Indigenous people, or with Indigenous knowledges. And of course, with Indigenous knowledges, you're going to be building relationships with Indigenous people. What are some of those ways where you know, okay, this is what we're working with now. How are we going to be able to carry these relationships forward? And I, you know, I don't have, Ivy, I don't have any solutions around that. All I know is that at the University of Calgary now, we have our Indigenous strategy that offers significant insights and certainly clarity around the importance of how do we do this in a good way? How do we build sustainable relationships with Indigenous communities, Indigenous faculty, Indigenous students in a way where we're able to hand off of whether we're moving on. We all, you know, that's one thing we, you know, it's things are temporary, but that relationship building and, you know, maintaining processes for ensuring that Indigenous peoples are part of the institution in really direct ways. Those processes should be permanent, you know, and people should know about them. So even if one contractor is gone, there's another, that person will know, well, I got to move on, but I know that work that I did, it's going to carry forward. So oftentimes we think in these 5-year sort of, you know, 5-year increments. Okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, and we're going to do this in the 5 years. Let's evaluate, okay, on to something new, you know. And when we're talking about Indigenous issues, or there's Indigenous initiatives that are happening on campus, it's often driven by what's happening in the broader social context. And so I remember in 2020, you know, there was lots of talk about the recovery of the Indigenous students and from these mass graves from the Indian residential schools. That's really died down. And so there's still work that's happening, but it's just not out there. It's kind of not that. So what is the flavor of the month for institutions? What is trending in terms of Indigenous peoples, right? That also shapes things as well. And so, yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Ivy. I'm just reading through the chat here. So Jill, if I'm curious if you have any papers published to easily draw on your scholarship to push for positive change within institutions. I've done some publishing around some in SOTL, so the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, especially around complicity in colonization through in our disciplines and in faculty and you know, faculty kind of perhaps not consciously advancing, you know, colonial ideology and colonial practices in their pedagogy, but certainly that's been the outcome of it. So I do have some recent publications on that. And so Jill, if you reach out to me, I can certainly share those with you. They might be helpful. Thank you for that feedback, Patty. I'm glad that was helpful. Catherine, I'm trying to imagine process-based course outcomes, for lack of a better way of explaining shifting, to focus on the journey rather than the destination. Absolutely. And so the outcomes are going to happen, right? Through the process, the outcomes will be there. it's just that the difference is, it's not that we don't have outcomes. It's not that we don't have goals. It's just that they're not so, like, they're not driving the process, right? It's the process itself that is of that's what we focus on. So maintaining good feelings, understanding what the issues are, understanding what the tensions are, understanding that people are emotional, people come with emotions, people are complex, people are multifaceted and multidimensional, right? And so I know that there's been some good work done in terms of, and if we're talking about curriculum development itself, which we are, but some good work around creating course outcomes, for example, at the course level with students. That's one example. Crystal says, has there been much work by institutions to create credit courses that teach standardized material through Indigenous knowledges and an Indigenous knowledge keeper? I feel like we talk a lot about inclusion in the curriculum, but rarely do we act. There is some work happening, but the thing about it is, I don't know if it's standardized, and standardizing curriculum, especially when it comes to Indigenous people, that comes with some problems in and of itself.
Okay, so it'd be better to create, like, just work with a group to kind of create something new instead,
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And Patty, yeah, if the curriculum isn't outcomes based, but rather process based, what does that look like? And this is where partnerships come in. This is where they're going to absolutely be vital to understanding what that looks like, because it's going to look different. And then I think it's perhaps that I always remember, like we're used to standards. We're used to outcomes. We're used to following a plan. We're used to systematic methods, right? And Indigenous education and Indigenous pedagogy, Indigenous ways of knowing, it's not like we're just completely flippant in things. It's when we have balance in relationships, when we understand the autonomy of individuals, and when we understand that we exist within this flux, that permanence is really it isn't, it's not sustainable, and it's not realistic, and that there is diversity in the process itself. When we're allowed to even trust that process, the outcomes will come, and what is the outcome? Well, people have a transformative experience, but you can't really define what transformation means for one person, right? And what that looks like. Going through a process is an outcome of itself, right? Caitlin, that's a good point. This also allows learners to engage with information at their level and grow from where they're at. So if anything, absolutely, Savannah, like, it's meeting people where they're at. And it really is, this is about shifting. This is about shifting and reframing and really moving beyond our comfort zone in curriculum planning. That's what I'm really hoping these workshops will generate, is another way of understanding and approaching the process.
This just makes me think of something that someone told me a long time ago, and that the way that we frame education and learning is that it's finite, and that you go to school from grade 1 to 12 and then you're done learning. And I think moving into more process focused outcomes kind of teaches people that we're always learning, and that's a function of being alive. And I think that that is an inherently, that perspective is kind of inherent in a lot of Indigenous ways of relating to the world and being in the world, is that we are here to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, Savannah. And it's like, when we're trying to understand a new concept, we're always like, we go back to our frame of reference, and then our current, what makes sense to us. This is what makes sense to us. But why does it make sense to us? In order to deconstruct and really start understanding and participating in another way of knowing, we need to deconstruct that sense making. And why does it make sense to us? What keeps me here? Why, if this makes sense to me, but it doesn't make sense to a 90-year-old Indigenous elder, and I need to ask why. If I need cultural awareness training, if I'm asking, I need cultural competency training, if I need that, and so many Indigenous people coming from the reserve who are Indigenous language speakers don't need that, and they can work with many different cultural groups regardless, then what is that? Why is that? What is that paradigm? That's why we always start at the level of paradigm, right? And that's where we start first, right? Because we need to understand our own limitations and the limitations of our sense making, and really need to understand it, that we do have limitations, that sense making, it's going to work in this context. But in order for it to work in this relational context, then I need to deconstruct that. And that's something that I can be guided in. There's some key questions, but at the end of the day, the hard work is mine alone, right? And so that's the discomfort that being in the ethical space is about, right? It's sitting in that discomfort and understanding that, being prepared to go on this oftentimes confusing ride, but trusting that the process of transformation, when you come out of that, things will change, right? And in a good way, your relationships expand, and the way you see the purpose of knowledge changes. You do things differently. We are different, and we are all different. And that's what Indigenous education is about. Indigenous pedagogy is about always moving, always towards the ultimate, to become that ultimate person in balance, strength, meaning we're balanced, where we know who we are, and we can connect with relational alliances beyond the human, right? And when we start connecting to that universal consciousness, everything is related to you. Everything and everyone is related to you. So that's that relational orientation. When you see that everything is related to you, your accountabilities change. Absolutely, right? Then you can begin to identify beyond the color of skin, beyond our limited nationalities and all of that. So yeah. And Kim, we are very used to backward design, but this sounds to me like a kind of forward design approach that sets more open-ended goals. Such in this course, students will be supported in beginning to articulate their worldview about. So absolutely, I mean, this just gets us starting to new avenues of thought, right? So Nancy, this makes so much sense on a humanistic level, is moving towards this perspective viewed as assimilation. See, that's using that same kind of sort of, and we use it all the time, right? Is to assimilate. So we're using the same kind of frame of reference when we're talking about are trying to understand this. So the Indigenous frame of reference is about inclusivity, a relational orientation, and an Indigenous paradigm. When you honor autonomy and when you honor the self-governance of people, you don't expect them to assimilate. They got free choice and to do whatever they want to do. If this makes sense, you come at this in a way where it's going to make sense to you and meet you where you're at. What this gives is a entry point into understanding relationships, so you can have clarity on how and why Indigenous people have the kinds of experiences in Canada as we do. We're not asking settler people to assimilate into our ways. That would be counterproductive and absolutely in opposition, direct opposition to the teachings of Indigenous peoples and the paradigm. So that's kind of where, we kind of go to that, but no, that wouldn't make sense. If we go back to paradigm, then we'll see why it's not just a flip, right? It's not just a flip. So I hope that makes sense. I know we've just got like 2 minutes. So yeah, I know we've just got 2 minutes, but a couple more comments here. I think from Ivy, I'm thinking that we need to expand some of our timelines. Absolutely. That's another thing there's so many things to consider. Thanks for bringing that up. We're driven by timelines, and within the Indigenous paradigm, time just is. It's not something that drives what we're doing. We're going to get things done. We're going to do what we need to do if we trust and we follow that process in a good way. However long it takes, time just is, right? That's something we have absolutely no control over. I love the idea of forward design that starts with what does the learner's experience and journey look like, instead of the starting point being where will the learners end up. Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for this wonderful dialogue, and absolutely, I do not purport to have all of the answers for sure, but at least I'm hoping that I provided some clarity on processes and relationships from an Indigenous perspective. So thank you for your time. And I look forward to, if you could join me next week, that would be wonderful. So be well, everyone.